It's Monday, and that so happens to be the day that I like to talk about monsters. Hello, and welcome to Monster Mondays. I'm Geoff Arbuckle, co-host of the weekly podcast Film Seizure that you can catch every Wednesday at filmseizure.com or at a number of podcast providers online. Now, we close out our little trip to Japan this month with another first of a trilogy. The Yokai Monsters trilogy was released over the course of 1 year, from March of 1968 to March of 1969, and begins with this week's feature, 100 Monsters. This is one of those kind of curious trilogies, kind of like the Rebirth of Mothra trilogy that I previously covered, in that there's no super clear lineage and continuity from one movie to the next, save for a couple of small connecting pieces. In the Mothra films of the 90s, it was the twin fairies and their usual battle against their evil sister. For the Yokai Monsters trilogy, there is pretty much just 3 standalone films that make up this trilogy that borrow from the same source material for their creatures and their themes. The yokai. Now, in Japanese, yokai means strange things. These are mythical creatures in Japanese culture. And as I continue to dig into this, you'll see where else this has possibly continued to appear throughout Japanese pop culture even to today. Basically, yokai were usually born out of supernatural situations. The older the era of Japanese history, the more things were attributed to supernatural instances that would ultimately create yokai. However, much of the culture of the Japanese folks has roots in animism. That means that various types of spirits can inhabit things. In fact, when it comes to the earliest myths of Japan, all things have some sort of spirit that inhabit them. Now, there were peaceful spirits that were called Nigimatama, that could bring fortune to a person, place, or family. And then there were rather violent spirits, the Aramitama, and I probably butchered those 2 pronunciations, but still, the violent ones would bring illness or disaster and so forth. And they were basically the driving forces of emotions and personalities within people. However, while those 2 types of spirits could possess personalities and emotions of peoples and things, they were not yokai. Yokai are really different types of spirits that create something a little more physical and creature-like. There are several ways to classify a yokai. For example, there's the yokai's true form, which could be human, animal, plant, or an inanimate object, or some sort of natural phenomenon. They could also have a different way to potentially show themselves to a person as a human, plant, animal, artifact, structure, or building, a natural object or phenomenon, or a combination of any of the other forms. Now, in Western culture, we might look at this as something similar to how our zodiac signs have a representation and then a classification of water, fire, air, etc. So a true form of a yokai may be your, Aunt Gertrude, but she mutates into something that looks like a crazy, scary version of your Aunt Gertrude, and mixed with a cactus or something. Now, how can Aunt Gertrude mutate? Well, it might have come from something that is going on in this physical world that we inhabit, or something related to old Gertie's spiritual or mental health, or as a form of reincarnation, or something that comes from a material object. Now, I suspect I've gotten some of this wrong. I am really just learning about this stuff right now with the rest of you that are listening. However, I'm not going to lie. When I first saw the types and the classifications and so on, the first thing I thought of, and probably super oversimplified this, is the popular Pokemon series. Those little creatures range from cute and cuddly to scary looking to just being flat out weird. But they also all have some sort of classification as to what they are as well. They also mutate and seemingly take on the personality of their captor too. And now that I think about it, Pokemon are basically indentured servants of whoever caught them. Now, that's kind of messed up, but I digress. Yokai are quite popular across pretty much every era of Japanese culture. They appear in films, in stories, in anime, and in comics. In some ways, you could even say that there have been instances in Godzilla and other kaiju films that borrow from the more spiritual yokai and the Aramitama concepts. Now, I should point out that this trilogy did inspire a 2005 film from Takashi Miike called The Great Yokai War, and it's considered a loose remake of the middle chapter of the 60s trilogy, Spook Warfare, and I really like that title. But anyway, The Great Yokai War spawned its own sequel last year, The Great Yokai War Guardians. We're a long way away from getting to those, but let's check out these kooky crazy creatures that I've been promised will hit triple digits in 100 Monsters. Now, the movie opens with a man lost in the forest and attempting to find the road. And he's not alone in the woods, though. He's being stalked by a one-eyed hairy beast. When the man tries fleeing from the creature, that creature is able to summon a powerful wind to blow the man back into its arms. The man later tells people in his town what he experienced. However, it also appeared to him to simply be a dream about a creature he believed he encountered before some years prior. So the village leader leads the town in a ceremony to remove a curse on his town. He says that this is a gathering to tell the tales of 100 monsters. And as each story is told, a candle is extinguished until all 100 candles are blown out and the curse is gone. Now, this is taking place in a town that we spend most of our story in or around, and it really is just kind of illustrating how this ceremony works. Now, I should mention that that it's notable that this town is in some pretty deep trouble. An evil landlord is planning on destroying this town that he's obtained the land for through basically default on a loan, essentially. And he wants to build a brothel in its place. So I guess that might be a reasonable explanation for there being, 100 monsters running around, but what do I know? Well, one of the things that he wants to tear down in this town is the shrine. That seems like a not so great idea when the village can request some revenge from, possibly 100 monsters. But the landlord's goons are pretty awful as they demand people to clear out of the town pretty much immediately. And like I said, they were going to tear down that aforementioned shrine, and just for the insolence of the caretaker of the town standing up to them, they are also going to tear down the tenement building where everyone lives to just be dicks. They also start basically wrecking everyone's stuff in this town to just kind of bully them around. But when the town's beloved old caretaker dies from the beating that he took, some want to go and deal with these landowners and take revenge. But the town's strapping young hero-like guy talks them out of it. He's not protecting the bad guys or standing against the town wanting to get back at the bad guys. No, he just doesn't want to see any more people get hurt or killed. Now, the landowners are powerful and quite resourceful, so these villagers are likely not able to really do anything about them directly. Now, meanwhile, back at the bad guys' hangout, they are hearing the stories of the various yokai. We start with a story of two men at a river fishing where they are not allowed. An old man appears and tells the two men that they shouldn't be fishing or hunting or anything else, or they will be visited upon by a terrible curse. Now, the two men don't take the old man seriously and basically laugh at him. After hours of trying, the men finally capture what appears to be a carp, but they ignore the voice of the old man that kind of comes back to them in the wind, saying that to basically leave the fish behind. So they get back home, and one of the men is married, and the wife prepares the fish for dinner, but she's unable to wash the blood of the fish off her fingers after cleaning it. And she starts acting kind of strange until her neck begins to elongate and stretch. The woman then begins haunting the two men with her stretchy neck until they essentially die of fright. However, this was all a vision. They actually never returned home. The wife who became the monster in their vision comes looking for them, but she is shown their dead bodies by the old man at the river, and he says that they died from being struck by lightning for ignoring the curse. Now, the old man leading the ceremony of the 100 stories concludes the ceremony by saying, it's time to do this ritual to cleanse the curse from the land. But our main bad guy, the major landlord of the area, basically scoffs at this and tells the old man to get lost. He sees superstitions are for the weak-minded. And our strapping young hero from the village earlier, who turns out is a Ronin, he's actually a masterless samurai, he's sneaked into the ceremony to basically tell the greedy landlords that things aren't going to go as they planned, and then he escapes. Now, some goons who receive payment from the landlords for being goons are scared into leaving their gold pieces by a floating fireball, another yokai. So the yokai are beginning to close in around the greedy landlords and their goons. It just so happens to be the 30 gold pieces that are told to be left behind that are owed to the landlord to pay off a debt that's leading to this whole mess with the village. Now, one of the landlords has this dim-witted son who's, I think they try to basically say that he may be mentally incapacitated because they say that he still has the mind of a child or whatever. But he becomes enamored by a drawing of one of the yokai, a folded umbrella with a single eye and a long tongue, and he begins drawing it on the walls all over his room until it actually comes to life. However, he's unable to convince his parents of what he saw after it left the room. Now, the village leader goes to pay off his debt because he's received the 30 gold coins from our hero character, and he's going to get the deed to the village back. But he's killed on the way home so that the landlord, basically who has the deed, who's owed the debt, he wants to kill the guy so he can reclaim the deed, and he still also has his 30 pieces of gold. Now, the body of the old man is found by his daughter when it surfaces in the river. The town knows that the landlord is behind it, but without the deed, there's really nothing they can do to stop their village from being taken and ultimately demolished. The village leader's daughter is basically sold off to our big bad landlord in exchange for keeping the tenement building standing. However, the guy who owns the deed on the village basically reneges on the deal, and they plan to go forward with the demolition anyway. Our Ronin hero saves the daughter, but the demolition is about to begin. When the shrine is toppled, a green ball of light appears in the sky, kills a goon with a spear, and then turns the sky blood red. None of this seems to be very good. But then faceless monsters begin to appear and attack the top goon that's leading the demolition. He flees, and the rest of the men sent by the landlord, those who actually turned into the faceless creatures, seem to also vanish and run off. The umbrella monster returns to the mansion to visit the dim-witted son of that landlord. However, the monster is not alone. There are now 3 umbrella monsters. When the top goon returns to the mansion, he sees yet another faceless monster before speaking to his boss. To prove his story, he takes his boss to the village, but a giant female monster begins tormenting the pair on the road to the village. And when the boss believes he stabbed one of the giants, it's revealed that he actually killed his own lieutenant. In fright, he stumbles and falls on his dead goon's sword and ultimately dies. And it just so happens to be on the same patch of road where they killed the old man to get the deed to the village back. Now, the yokai are all over the place. Our Ronin comes to combat the chief villain, the big bad guy, the head cheese, but finds him lecturing no one. He's actually being besieged by a whole bunch of yokai. He tries fighting them, but they are pretty wily and like ghostly apparitions, so he's really not having much luck here. The yokai eventually disappear, but it leaves our big bad a stark raving mad loon. But when he recovers clarity and his sanity, he's approached by our samurai hero, who happens to work for the High Magistrate and delivers the warning that the bad guy's misuse of his powers will be investigated, and he's basically ruined. To basically avoid this disgrace, the evil landlord commits seppuku, and the yokai celebrate and dance in what appears to be almost like a parade before returning to the spirit world. This is now part of the show where I will list my 3 things that I like about Yokai Monsters 100 Monsters. And the first thing is that this is less a movie about monsters or spirits or what have you, and more about a dramatic parable of how to properly use power and riches, and how it really doesn't serve you well to just go into a neighboring village and tear down their homes and religious shrines and stuff. It's kind of bad juju that you're putting on yourself to do this sort of crap. And sure, you can risk it, you can basically ask if there really is a lesson to be learned here. Well, not really in the way that you think. Again, it comes down to the moral being one of karma. What you do and how you treat others will follow you. The landlord's greed and taking advantage of the village's leader who needed medicine to try to save his dying wife led to a debt that the landlord knew couldn't be repaid. So he was basically using his stature and his power and his wealth against a simpler person who was only trying to keep to help save someone. The old village leader didn't need money to be happy. He had his wife and his community. The greedy landlord only wanted the value of the land by collecting the gold that would be raked in by the brothel. So it's sort of the old scenario of money making you greedy and doing bad things and being a bad person and what have you, versus being happy with what you have and not wanting for anything more. But by being a jerk, it invited all the bad other things to come along and haunt the one who's basically going against decency toward tradition, community, etc. And the monsters almost come across as warnings and metaphysical concepts and what have you. It's an interesting use of the legends and those kind of morality tales. Now, second, man, some of these monsters are weird but really cool at the same time. In this movie, you have an umbrella that's a monster. It's got a single eye and a giant tongue that it uses to lick the little kid. But instead of the pole, like a normal umbrella would have, it has a leg, a single leg, foot and all. That's bonkers, but I love the imagination of it. Another monster is just a floating ball of fire, nothing more, nothing less. You have the big hairy monster at the start of the movie that can make wind blow people into his grasp. The monster isn't what's all that interesting, because big hairy monsters are almost a staple of these types of monster concepts, but it's the power to create the wind that's kind of nuts. Of course, you have the big-headed lady monster. That's kind of terrifying. I wouldn't be surprised if the show and manga for Attack on Titan borrows from that kind of yokai to create their giants and the facial expressions that they usually are shown with. The lady with the rubbery neck was spooky as hell. One of the monsters that we see later just basically looks like a turtle. Yeah, he's a turtle with a shell and everything. Another looks like he's wearing a full-body grass skirt. And just has a giant ball for a head. It's almost like a Frank Sidebottom monster. One monster had what appeared to be a wolf's head. So what I'm getting at is that you have all sorts of ideas here in play. Remember, yokai could be just about anything in monster form, and that's what we see. The effects and makeup on them are fantastic for being a movie filmed in 1967. This is Daiei. This is the studio that made Gamera, which were really super cheap looking movies, and this movie looks better than most Godzilla movies, at least of the era. And I kind of thought the same thing with Daimajin too, that it was a good looking movie and much above the standard of what Daiei was making with Gamera films. But yeah, the and stuff like the rubbery neck monster is done exceptionally well. The giant with the big face looked really cool and mixed in nicely with the actors in the foreground of those shots. The umbrella creature kind of reminded me of the rubbery Tasmanian devil from the Twilight Zone the movie, when the kid brought that to life from the Looney Tunes cartoon on TV. It's just great. But that also connects to my third like, and that's the concept of how good the monsters looked. How good the whole movie looks is marvelous. You can tell most of the night shots seem to be in a studio, but it looked perfect. And that's because this movie is meant to look like what you'd imagine while being told a story, or what you might see in a dream or nightmare. I found that to be the perfect way to present this film. Not only is this clearly told from a time in the past, probably at least a couple of 100 years ago, if not more, but it just doesn't feel real. It feels almost out of step with what we would expect to see. It feels like one of those, it feels like one of or it kind of looks like one of the tapestries the guys who go around and perform the 100 Stories ceremony would bring with them to illustrate what they're talking about. It's beautiful in that way. With it not really feeling real, it kind of unsettles you too. So it kind of keeps a haunted feeling, even if this isn't wall-to-wall yokai until the final 15 minutes or so. There was a well-thought-out vision for what this movie needed to look like, and it nails it. Well, that wraps up this week's Monster Mondays. You can catch new episodes of Monster Mondays each Monday at filmseizure.com. Don't forget to follow Film Seizure at Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram, and subscribe to Film Seizure to get both the Film Seizure Podcast and Monster Mondays at your favorite podcast providers, as well as YouTube. You can also check out my website, bmovieanima.com, to read new articles every Friday morning. As we head into a new month, we're going to go back to the couch and fire up the old boob tube for a whole month of TV monsters. And we'll get things started by checking in on our good friend Carl Kolchak as we dive into the first episode of the Kolchak the Night Stalker series with episode number 1, The Ripper. So until next week, stay spooky.